great turnout. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to everyone who supported me in this process, as well as the Center for Community Geography for hosting. I know the vast majority of you, but my name's Gus, and I'm a senior here. And this is my honors thesis. So how many of you are familiar with Oryx in New Mexico? Around half. So Oryx are a large species of antelope that was introduced from South Africa to New Mexico in the 1960s for the purpose of big game hunting. And my dad works as a hunting guide and outfitter, and I kind of grew up around them. And growing up, I kind of had the same perspective as a lot of people in southern New Mexico who grew up in the Tula Basin and in the Las Cruces area. You don't really see them as any different from elk or deer in terms of how you see them as part of the landscape and part of the beauty of the area. And it wasn't until in my freshman year of college I drew a once-in-a-lifetime Oryx hunt on the Missile Range, and kind of investigating that and thinking more critically about it and looking at how contentious Oryx are within the ecosystem because the National Park Service considers them an invasive species. Kind of led me to investigate it a little more clearly. And I knew from the beginning of starting to do an honors thesis I wanted to focus on something around this. But when I was reading a lot of the literature around it, there were two kind of things that stuck out to me. First and foremost, so there is tons and tons of environmental literature. Well, maybe not tons, it's a pretty niche subject, but plenty of articles talking about the ecological concerns around the Oryx and their status as an invasive species. But most of them conclude that this perspective should be balanced with the cultural and economic importance of Oryx. And that's never really expanded upon beyond a very flat, okay, they generate 1.4 million a year for game and fish. And then on top of that, thinking about that cultural importance in southern New Mexico, how that relates to invasive species status in southern New Mexico. So I know in the department here we love iNaturalist. I've got a nice little iNaturalist map here of the range of Oryx here in New Mexico. It mostly confines to the White Sands Missile Range, which stretches from around Socorro down to Las Cruces. It's the largest military installation in the country. And their range is starting to expand outside of it a little bit. As you can see, down around the Guadalupe Mountains, they're starting to expand a little bit east, but it's very rare for them to go west of the Rio Grande or north of Berlin. But Oryx, when you take a look at it, you're like, okay, how did this African species get introduced here to New Mexico? And it has its origins in the mind of Frank Hibben. So yeah, if you're up on your UNM lore, I think a lot of you are probably at least a little bit familiar with Frank Hibben. What's that?
His building's next door.
Oh yeah, his building's next door. He's pretty contentious nowadays. It's been exposed after his death that a lot of his findings were fabricated, as well as, of course, the stolen totem pole in the anthropology building. But he had a lot of political connections in New Mexico that were rooted in kind of the sensationalized fame around his archaeological adventures. And he was close friends with Gil Maxwell, who the Maxwell Museum is named after, and Tom Bullock, who was a early oil baron of the Farmington and Aztec area. And Tom Bullock was governor for a period of 30 days in 1961, based on essentially mere circumstance. And Bullock and Hibben were pretty good safari buddies in Africa. They went out there all throughout the 50s and 60s. And Tom appointed Hibben as the head of the Game Commission of New Mexico, which essentially meant he was in charge of all wildlife affairs in the state. And Hibben made introducing exotic species a primary concern of his tenure. The White Sands Missile Range was relatively new. It had come about through the dispossession of a lot of ranchers in the Tula Rosa Basin area, which is still pretty politically contentious in terms of their neighbors and people who want their land back. But they essentially approached it as making use out of an empty landscape as they saw it. Even though it was only empty because so many people had been cumulatively dispossessed over time. And Oryx weren't the only species considered. They also attempted to introduce gazelle and kudu, Siberian ibex, Persian ibex, which we do have down in Deming. They were introduced down there too. But Oryx are the ones who are most successful in ecological factors because they ate the native wildlife or native flora and could survive the winter, as well as the fact that when they were introducing them, it was on Hibben's dime because the state didn't want to fund it, and Hibben was head of the Albuquerque Zoo also. So he incubated this species down near Deming, and they enclosed them in a normal fence that they were able to escape pretty easily. And so you're like, oh, guess we have Oryx now. But this was prior to the National Environmental Policy Act, so legally there was no ecological concerns or considerations that were necessary, nor did they think that they needed any. And there were three main justifications. One, it would fill an ecological niche left behind by the extinction of megafauna in the Tula Basin, of course ignoring the fact that the land had been culled of most predators during the era of ranching. Secondly, and most prominently, which I'll get into, it would provide a source of tourism for the Tula Basin and bring in all sorts of hunting money. And thirdly, according to Hibben, and he also served as Nixon's advisor on South African affairs, so think of that what you will. But according to him, African and Middle Eastern nations in the era of post-colonialism could not be trusted to not hunt their wildlife to extinction, and therefore White Sands would serve as a sort of wildlife refuge and a sort of extinction valve in the case that that did happen. And so Hibben pays around $1,000 a head today for each of the 5 Oryx. So it's a very small initial population that they're started from, and it's kind of interesting. Today you see some effects from that population being so small. For instance, in New Mexico, the Oryx runs will break. They're very brittle just about every winter, which isn't something you see in Africa. And the population is never expected to exceed 500. And they mainly justified that number based on, they said that Oryx would be limited to areas which were mostly mesquite and creosote, which, by the way, the Oryx don't actually eat. And they would be limited to those areas and not impede on deer habitat or antelope habitat. And hunting starts in 1974. It's very much advertised as a source of out-of-state tourism. And this justification was given as a financial means of making revenue for the department was cemented by the Supreme Court case Turk v. Gordon. So Dave Turk was a friend of Hibben, who was a sheep hunter from Texas. And he sues the states of New Mexico, Colorado, and Montana for their hunting license distribution system, which was very protectionist. For a lot of reasons surrounding the conservation era, hunting tag distribution in New Mexico was rooted in a protectionism that allowed wildlife to essentially be treated as more of a community asset. And so I'll get back to this, but 84% of all tags in New Mexico are reserved for New Mexico residents. He sues them, the state of New Mexico, saying that this is discrimination on the basis that he's a Texan. The Supreme Court says that, okay, New Mexico is allowed to do that, but Oryx are an exception. The state is not allowed to have a cap or a quota of New Mexico residents in Oryx hunts. So therefore, because of course there's more out-of-state hunters than in-state hunters, this cements a sort of financial regime within Oryx hunting as that means of attracting out-of-state money. I'm still visualizing the data for my final thesis from Game and Fish, but you very much do see in this era that most of the hunters and most of the applicants are out-of-state hunters. And as a result of this, they are managed as that site of accumulation of currency, and as a means of attracting money for both the military base and game and fish. And the population hits a high of around 3,000 in the mid-1990s, which, along with the Invasive Species Act in 1999, very much raises concern of them as an invasive species when, in that time, there were crazy droughts in the Tula Basin. And so, as you can see here, this is kind of a breakdown of how hunting tag distribution normally works in New Mexico. 84% are reserved for residents, 10% are reserved for those who apply to New Mexican hunts through an outfitter, and then 6% are reserved for non-residents. And in the case of the Oryx, after the Supreme Court case, the Turk injunction, all these numbers were 33%. And federal authorities start considering lethal enforcement against Oryx encroachment, but communities and other organizations around the area were very much opposed to it. So as you can see here, they went about non-lethal means, and this is an Oryx who was tranquilized and removed via helicopter from the area. The national park response to the Oryx cost about $1.5 million by 2003, including a several-mile-long, 6-foot-tall fence that was quickly overrun by the Oryx. And in this period, you see a lot of scientific literature that explores that ecological damage, mostly shrub encroachment, which is kind of the same process that happens with cattle overgrazing, where when a range is overgrazed, things such as mesquite grow in as a monocrop. And also concerns about disease which were spread to native ungulates. So since that initial 5 population were born and bred in a zoo, they all were in enclosed territories, and all their descendants have a series of diseases that are a result of that enclosure that can spread to native wildlife such as deer and antelope. However, there is a lot of complications that most ecologists are willing to get into surrounding the relationship between Oryx and other native species. So, like any invasive species, it very much raises the question of, okay, is this something that's tied directly to the presence of the Oryx, or is this something that's tied to other social causes of native population degradation that is tied to social factors? So, one area where that's especially prominent is that of disease among deer in the Tula Basin. So, chronic wasting disease essentially is, you could kind of think of it as mad cow disease for deer and elk. It is mostly spread as a factor of being in an enclosed area. So here we have a map of it, and it started initially in Colorado, and it's thought to have originated on game farms for the private game meat industry. And in New Mexico, the only place you really see it is on the Missile Range. So it's kind of interesting to think about that enclosure as another factor in what is driving those deer populations down, as well as the historical fact of cattle encroaching on that deer population in terms of the shrub encroachment that happened previously. And you also look at, in terms of disease, there's so much we don't know about how Oryx transfer those to native ungulates. A lot of it is more about possibility rather than actively recording disease being transferred from Oryx to deer, and a lot of that disease that happens among deer is, again, it's this symptom of that enclosure. And this definitely brings into the case a lot of other literature around invasive species and the social causes of them. Like when we think about jellyfish, which are a pretty common issue in parts of the area, the ocean, a lot of the areas where jellyfish are an issue as a result of climate change and overfishing. And we also think about the same presence of Oryx happening in places where deer habitat has been made uninhabitable by the activities of the Missile Range. And you also see that in the southern parts of the Missile Range, where even Oryx are being impacted by the activities of the Missile Range. When this doesn't impact the White Sands as much, but on Holloman, they've recorded the highest percentage of, or I guess concentration of PFAs that have ever been recorded in a living being in the Holloman Oryx. And that kind of brings into question how economic and natural isolation and the enforcement of those categories plays into how we're thinking about Oryx. So philosophers Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway talk a lot about where hybrids emerge and how we're thinking about modern nature. And especially when you're thinking about Oryx, I mean, this is an organic being, but it's placed in this completely unnatural engineered structure of the Missile Range as a kind of new nature. I mean, it was initially brought in as a source of out-of-state hunting money, as a fetishized exotic species so that hunters wouldn't have to pay the money to go safari in Africa and would instead do it in New Mexico. And this kind of brings into question how we think about capitalism as a means of organizing nature, which Jason Moore puts forth as the co-production of earth-moving, idea-making, and power-creating across the geographical layers of the human experience. And when we're thinking about White Sands Missile Range, as you know, throughout the history of capitalism, when you think about the dispossession of its indigenous inhabitants, as well as the proliferation of the cattle industry, and then that production of space with the missile range. This is another proliferation of creating territory that is in the interest of capital by bringing these Oryx in as a source of money. However, this isn't to say that just throw your hands up in the air, it's all socially produced anyways. With the Oryx, you also start to see some interesting conflict that happens around that new nature that's produced. And a lot of where you see that is Oryx, despite being an unnatural being in that environment, are incorporated into a lot of political struggles that happen around hunting and commons in New Mexico. So this article is really good from Robbins and Luganbull, where they talk about, I guess you could say, political radicalism and the commons among elk hunter associations in Montana, where they talk about a lot of the struggle that happens in those communities is making sure that game management is happening in the interest of resident access to wildlife that is a common resource for the local population versus a wealthy amenity for out-of-state hunters. And Oryx were introduced with the intention of being that wealthy amenity. However, hunting organizations such as the New Mexico Wildlife Federation, who are very much kind of a, I guess you could classify them a more left-leaning organization in terms of the hunting lobby, overturned Turk v. Gordon in 2013 with the argument that this presence of the Oryx is being managed in a way that is ecologically detrimental because it is in favor of those out-of-state hunters. It is happening in favor of the accumulation of capital rather than as a common resource. And so with that overturning, you start to see more community involvement in protecting these Oryx as a native, I guess, incorporated species and as a common resource, which is especially important with how fragile the ecosystem is becoming, even more so today with climate change. And of course, wildlife science as a whole, since the conservation era, is mostly centered around creating that Oryx as a commodity. But a lot of the ways that's changing is also centered around the Oryx. Like in the Roundhouse this past spring, they passed a bill that is going to transform the Department of Game and Fish into a Department of Wildlife, which is going to grant the department much more political independence. So the Game and Fish Department is a appointed position, and everyone on the commission is appointed by the governor. This legislation, a pretty rare collaboration between the New Mexico Wildlife Federation and the New Mexico Council of Outfitters and Guides, is going to incorporate a lot more community decentralized voices in managing that wildlife rather than simply appointees from the governor. And so this kind of brings back to the question of how we think about that cultural and economic importance when it's not really put out there as anything other than that $1.4 million. And this is a photo from a taxidermy shop down in Las Cruces. And it's interesting to think about how, you know, despite this being so tied up into histories of dispossession and the nuclear industrial complex in New Mexico, they are very much something that has been brought into the cultural fold of a lot of people in southern New Mexico, and they are dependent on it for their livelihoods in subsistence ways and economic ways and cultural ways, in a way that's not for out-of-state hunters as it was initially. It's something that they see as for them and part of their landscape and their connection to nature. So that is my presentation. Thank you guys very much for coming, and yeah, questions.
Thank you guys, that was fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm super into this whole topic, and I've got a million questions for you, so I'm gonna have to restrain myself. So we're gonna have to have another conversation after this conversation.
Yeah.
Couple, but I'm just really impressed with this work at the undergraduate level. I'm interested. One of my questions will be like, where are you planning to take this next? So that's one question I have related to this. You've got a lot of different theoretical frameworks running around in here, which you don't have time to unpack all of in like 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So when you think about maybe taking this to the manuscript level or something like that, which of these theoretical frameworks, you've got Haraway running around, the tour running around, booking some different concepts, and the saying, all pulling on somewhat different threads. Obviously, you've got a Marxist thread running in here too. What thread are you going to pull on? I've got another suggestion, another thread that you may novelty ecosystems. I'm not sure if you've worked that literature at all, but which of these threads do you think you might most inform this, or even maybe pull on to really pull and net this all together for maybe as you move forward?
Yeah, well, for that first question, in terms of where I wanted to go with this, this photo is from Marcus Xavier Cormichael, who I also quoted there. Him and I met while I was working on this project. He's working as the artist in residence at the Lincoln Historical Site in southern New Mexico right now. And he's originally from Cruces. His family grew up hunting Oryx. And it was kind of funny, we were introduced and he was working on this subject in basically the same way at the same time, in different ways. It's definitely from a much more artistic perspective. And we're planning on collaborating on a article pitch for the High Country News, as well as a community zine with some community organizations in southern New Mexico. So that's the future of this project right now. We'll see about any sort of academic future with it in terms of a manuscript or anything like that. But in terms of those theoretical threads, I think that Donna Haraway and Anna Singh definitely have a much more kind of outcome-focused, I guess you could say, perspective on how we're thinking about this. In terms of, I have it a little more outlined in the manuscript versus the presentation. I had it a little bit in the initial draft of the presentation, which was so hard to expand on. With her idea of the Cthulhu theme, and how we approach these Oryx is something that is just so intertwined with these communities when thinking about how much they are embedded within the history of nuclearism in New Mexico, as well as the Missile Range itself. So kind of thinking about management and futures of the Oryx around that is, I think, something that would be really useful.
Okay, cool. And then I just one really practical question for you, because I didn't quite follow the conversation around chronic wasting disease. Do the Oryx all have chronic wasting disease? Are they giving it to deer? Are they giving it to them? Is it all over the place? Like, what's the...
So initially, the Game and Fish and the National Park Service were kind of half-heartedly blaming the Oryx for chronic wasting disease, but Oryx are not able to contract chronic wasting disease.
Okay.
That is something that is isolated to deer and elk, and it's a prion disease, so it's spread through like.
So they're not carriers?
Yeah, no. When an animal, like an infected deer, dies or defecates, it essentially infects the grass, and it spreads by that way.
Okay, thank you. All the others go down.
I'm curious, you were talking about how it's like the Bureau of Wildlife, which was Game and Fish. So how did that come about again?
So Michelle Lujan Grisham's actions with the Department of Game and Fish have been pretty controversial. It's always, of course, been a very politicized department. But right now is the first time in the Game and Fish's history where more than half of the board is not showing up to any meetings, essentially out of protest. And I don't know the political details of that, especially. But that's the main reason for it is landowners, public lands managers, hunting and fishing organizations, outfitters and guides have come to see us. Okay, we think this is too politicized. And while, of course, there are politics embedded in anything, we think this is not allowing the community voices that need to be heard. So that was the main initiative behind making the Department of Wildlife more independent.
So is it active now, or is it going to be active?
I believe it's supposed to initiate in 2027. And rather than being an appointed body, it's going to be an elected body of, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I believe it's one private landowner, one representative of a public lands hunting and fishing organization, one representative of a Council of Outfitters and Guides division, as well as one representative from the National Forest, as well as other public lands. And it's more than that, but divvied up based on stakeholder participation within that management.
Yeah, just thinking about kind of, you mentioned the new natures and the introduction of Oryx is like only happening by a human hand, but their proliferation and continued existence is kind of, even if we went completely hands off, would continue and spread. It sounds like this in other like shrublands and such. But I'm wondering, as you mentioned, the different jurisdictions that are involved in this, isn't because there's a FWS refuge within the missile range as well, right? The Oscuras, is that the mountain range?
I think so, yeah.
The Oscuras, you're talking National Park Service, you're talking DoD. How much is any conflict in management between these agencies like open for public view? Does this happen as a negotiated management plan? Are they all on the same page? Do they have differing outcomes?
So that's something I was really trying to get into, and I was kind of disappointed with what I was and wasn't able to dig up with that. Because, well, I did a lot of archival work for this project, and I was pretty lucky that Patrick Morrow, who was head of the Oryx program from 1980 until he retired this January, he went and turned in essentially everything that had ever been published about Oryx. And really, any of that public contention, almost all of that only happened in the 90s when the Invasive Species Act was signed, and it allowed those federal authorities more authority to respond to Oryx. And it's mainly contentious between the Sebelita National Wildlife Refuge and the National Park Service. Those are kind of the two main folks who are talking into the missile range and be like, hey, you guys need to get this under control. And it used to be a lot of private landowners around the missile range were very much opposed to them too. And of course a lot of them still are. But with that Turk injunction that allows more power to New Mexican hunters to engage with Oryx, a lot of those private land hunters have started to shift towards selling those private land tags as a means of making up for that shift away from out-of-state money. And so the language around that has shifted a lot of time, but unfortunately a lot of the stuff today that happens between the National Park Service and the range is not very public, although every invasive species week, which I think is in February, the National Park Service will post all sorts of things about the Oryx, but that's about the extent of it today.
Right, thanks.
So quick question, have you looked at doing an economic impact on you get the 1.6 million for the permits, but what is that impact as it goes out to the local areas tourism?
There's been a few of those that I wasn't really able to squeeze in here in depth because there's some nuances to it, but the New Mexico Council of Outfitters and Guides did one last year, as well as the Department of Game and Fish did one in I think 2013. Which was prior to that Turk injunction being overturned, so a lot of it is going to be much more money than it is today. But it's definitely shifted a lot in terms of the decline in that out-of-state money and being more focused on in-state kind of agglomerations of use of the land. Like I know the Council of Outfitters and Guides one, I don't remember all of it off the top of my head, but I remember that only about 2% of out-of-state hunters were primarily coming to New Mexico to hunt Oryx, which that's definitely a big shift from the original intention of the program. But yeah, that stuff will be in the final paper for sure.
One last question, maybe?
We've kind of talked about this project as you developed it, and you mentioned stuff about like, you know, the U.S. military and the Park Service butting heads a bit. What's sort of, I guess, the dominant perspective from like a regulatory standpoint on what should be done? You know, sort of beyond the allocation of permits, you know, as far as their spread and the impact that they're having, is there more of, you know, let's say from the Park Service, sort of more of an aggressive position about, you know, their containment, or is it a little bit more hands-off?
Yeah. The Park Service definitely compared to, you know, the various National Wildlife Refuge as well as the Hornada Experimental Range. The Wildlife Refuge and the Hornada Experimental Range are basically like, hey, you guys need to get your stuff under control, essentially. Whereas the National Park Service very much favors a lethal response to the Oryx. And that really was very publicly contentious in the 90s. A lot of people were opposed to it, both people who were seeing the national park as a recreation area and didn't want to see that, as well as animal rights organizations, as well as hunting organizations. Because the National Park Service was wanting the National Missile Range to also cull a lot of the population, which they did over time. That population was a height of about 4,000-ish, but today it's around 1,500. But yeah, the National Park Service definitely favored a lethal response, and a lot of the people I interviewed say that's kind of starting to bubble up a little more right now, because they see it as the main option of getting that under control and not spending the money that they don't have. But yeah.
Do you just Okay, one more question.
Would wolves solve this problem?
Yeah, pretty much. So the only natural predator of the oryx in the basin is mountain lions, and there's very few mountain lions in that area. Initially, when Hibbin and others were introducing them, they're like, okay, the ecological impact will be controlled by mountain lions. But it wasn't really something you saw up until very recently. They're kind of starting to get a taste for them, which is what a lot of biologists were saying. There was one group study, I think 2 years ago, where they were tracing that pattern, and they found that there was one mountain lion who had killed about 25 oryx. Yeah, like Soviet sniper numbers. But yeah, wolves are pretty contentious among the military personnel there, and a lot of the biologists don't seem to think that it would result in an immediate response to the issue. But right now, yeah, essentially hunting is the only population control for the oryx. But yeah, I do think wolf reintroduction would help a lot of issues there.
Okay, well, we can continue this conversation over coffee and pastries, which are in the next room, so let's give us a round. If you sit on a green chair, if you don't mind.
You're gonna read it tonight. Tell me
It's still going.